Welcome to CHCH Newsmakers. I'm Rick Zamprin. Back in the mid-1980s, Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson was considered the world's fastest man. He held the world record in the 100-meter dash and reached the zenith of his superstardom on September 24th, 1988 at the Summer Olympics in Seoul, South Korea. That's when he won gold in a never-before-seen 9.79 seconds and beat American rival Carl Lewis in the process. But Ben's world and legacy came crashing down in the days following the race. Our guest today is going to tell us how it all went down. Mary Ormsby started her career as a sports reporter with the Toronto Star in 1985. She has long been fascinated by sports, but more so the athletes and people involved behind the scenes. Last year, she wrote a book called World's Fastest Man, The Incredible Life of Ben Johnson, and she joins us on Newsmakers to talk about what she learned about Canada's biggest sports scandal. Mary, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
And thank you for writing this book. This brought back so many memories, as I told you before, good and bad, because it was the highest of highs and then the lowest of lows. What propelled you to write this book?
I think in a nutshell, it's because I was there in Seoul in 1988 when it happened and covered the aftermath and how ugly it was and how Ben was really, the rush, the kind of put him out of the public square for a lot of discussion. So a lot of what happened in Seoul and how in Seoul defended by Canadian officials was really suffocated. That whole discussion just didn't really happen then. You fast forward a couple of decades, and I kept in touch with Ben over the years and decades. And at one point, I just said, are you sure your drug tests and all that were looked at properly? And the answer was no, not really. And from that came a couple of Toronto Star stories when we found out that his actual drug test from Seoul was filled with irregularities and things that hadn't been signed and, scrawls and all that could have been challenged in 1988 in Seoul. And that's kind of the crux of the book. And Ben asked me to write the book. And after saying no for a couple of years, I finally said yes.
Yeah. So he was convinced that you would be able to tell the story as he wanted it to be told?
I think it's because I was one of the few people who were invested as a journalist in telling a story, thinking that he was probably a victim of historic injustice back in Seoul. And he's a very polarizing figure because we learned way early that, yes, in fact, he was taking steroids and had been taking them for like 7 or 8 years. So he's a polarizing sports figure. And he felt that I would be the one who might take a run at it and try to do it with more historical accuracy, trying to set the record straight in terms of what actually happened by relying on documents and interviews and doing it in a manner that way. So in my view, it's part cold case and part biography. So that's how we went about it. And he gave me kind of full reign. You go do it, and I'm sure it'll come out okay.
Yeah. We'll talk about how Ben is doing now a little later on, but I want to ask you, what was it like to sit down with him, nearly 30 years after this happened?
It was actually more powerful than I would have thought because Ontario was still going through COVID shutdown. So we started talking around late 2021, 2022. So he often came to my home where all my kids were, my dog and everything, and we would talk there. But a couple of times early on, he just broke down, crying, like sobbing. Like I'm not sure he'd gone to some of these deep, dark places. And he talked about the death of his mother, Gloria, who meant everything to him, and his father, and later on Charlie Francis. So a couple of those episodes happened. I thought, wow, this is like really powerful. But I didn't really know him all that well, so I went, no, do I hug him? Do I just go, oh, should I put the kettle on? I wasn't sure. So a lot of that powerful emotional stuff came out of Ben, and I think hopefully it's conveyed in the book that he wasn't RoboCop. He wasn't Robo-Ben. He's a person who was traumatized regardless of what he'd done. And I still think if there's a way to look at someone with PTSD or trauma, Ben is still, in my opinion, living through that because he was destroyed on a worldwide stage, worldwide ridicule, and this is before the internet even. So it was a heavy, heavy slog for him as a young man.
This process seems to be almost cathartic for him. He, got his emotions out on the table. He went to those dark places.
Yes, he did. And I also feel that his story's been told. He likes to say, my truth is out there. People didn't believe me back in the day when I said, this can't be. how could I possibly have tested positive and nobody else did? And he and Charlie held on to these, what people call conspiracy theories, for a very long time. So he feels vindicated in some way. At least the story's out there. People can make a better decision about, his role as a villain or as a fall guy.
So many great stories in this book, including how Ben became Big Ben. Here's a scrawny kid from Jamaica who, through years of training under the tutelage of Charlie Francis, and we'll talk about Charlie as well, became the sport's biggest star. How did he do it?
Largely, it was Charlie Francis. Charlie was a father figure to him, and Ben began to trust him completely. Ben's father stayed in Jamaica when his mother came up here with the kids in the mid-'70s to make a better life for themselves up there. But his dad was still in his life, but he was far away. And Charlie believed in him early. Ben was a little guy, and then he grew. He started growing to almost his full height, and I think by high school he was about 5'10". And Ben just had this capacity to be the perfect teaching machine and coaching machine. And he and Charlie, he often described it as one mind. And it worked. And eventually, it worked so well that Charlie thought, we should probably have this discussion about using steroids because in Charlie's world, everybody else was. So, you should consider it too.
So Charlie came to the conclusion, he just kind of alluded to it, that to unlock Ben's true potential, they would have to go down the avenue of banned substances.
Correct, because Charlie believed, rightly or wrongly, but back in the 80s, certainly was the Wild West of lots of people using performance-enhancing drugs, not just steroids, but Charlie's view was, and he's seen it himself when he was Canada's top sprinter, because he competed in Munich Olympics, that, everyone else, or at least most of your rivals, are using this stuff. And the famous line was, you can start on the start line with them by using this, these banned drugs, or you can start your starting blocks a meter behind everybody, because that's what the difference is going to be. So in that world, that's what they felt they needed to do. And back then, testing wasn't as rigorous, although, people are still getting caught today. But it certainly wasn't as rigorous as it purports to be today. And Ben thought about it for a week or two and went, yeah, I'm in.
Yeah, and it didn't sound like it took much convincing on Charlie's part.
No. He already had other athletes who were using the stuff. Angela Isajenko, when she was Angela Taylor at the time, she was the big star in Charlie's stable of stars. And she was, a world-class athlete, and she was certainly using the stuff. And Ben says in the book, too, I saw Angie coming home with all this money and all these muscles and records and stuff, and I thought, yeah, I'd like to be part of that, too.
Cy Williams, Mark McCoy, the list goes on and on.
Yes, there were lots.
Carl Lewis is another name that many people will remember, and world champion, Olympic champion, the fastest man on earth at one time, and a bitter rival to Ben Johnson. How did that develop?
Well, Carl Lewis, as you just said, he won four golds in the LA Olympics in 1984, and he was a big star, and he was bound to do it again in 1988. But Ben had won bronze in the 100 meters and then bronze with the Canadian relay team. Ben started beating Carl around 1985, 86. And what Ben had done after 84 was take the VHS tapes of Carl sprinting, and he studied them in his basement with Charlie helping him from every single angle. Like, how can we find the weakness in this guy? And the conclusion was, Carl Lewis was maxed out in speed, in their opinion. Ben had a lot of room to grow, and by then Ben was using steroids as well, and Ben did have room to grow, and that's when that started happening. Was the beating of him, mid '80s, and it just got really bitter. And two very different individuals. Here's Ben Johnson from, a very shy individual from a close-knit family. Carl Lewis getting accolades from a very early age, goes to university. Superstardom was laid at his feet. They couldn't have been more different. No, and Canadians began to, understand that as they began watching Ben's career, because to be the fastest man on earth, really, it still means something to this day, right? But we had our quiet Canadian guy who didn't say much, beating the big American star who was flamboyant,
Brash.
tried to sing national anthem, and was doing videos and all that, wanted to get into acting and all that. So it really played into this sort of patriotism that we had going into the late 80s when, Ben became the world's fastest man, winning the world championship in Rome, and then getting prepared for 1988 in Seoul. And the bitterness of the rivalry and the trash talking they did just fed into that rivalry that made them both so famous.
Yeah. A good chunk of the book is Ben's relationship with his mom, Gloria. You kind of alluded to it. If she wasn't in the picture, how different would his life have been?
I don't think they would have left Jamaica, most likely.
Right.
She was the one with the courage and took a chance on her marriage even by coming up here earlier to try to get into the rhythm. Canada had opened the pipeline to immigration, especially Commonwealth countries, much more so under Pierre Trudeau at the time. So she was the brave one who came up here and thought, I can do this. But she had to have, jobs and working up terrible hours and all that stuff. It would not have happened had it not been for her. And Ben felt that he was her protector, and he had to look after her, even at the age of 14, 15 when he was up here. And he devoted himself to her, and so much so that he never married. He didn't want to have anyone competing with his mom while she was alive, and just still feels that no one could measure up to her.
Ben did not devote a lot of his attention to school. I mean, he committed to being a pro athlete on the international stage, in early on in his life.
Yeah, and I think part of that, we talk about it in the book too, and you can see how students like Ben, who are quiet, and Ben had a terrible stutter at the time, and there was a lot of racist, stuff in the playground even, and he was just passed from grade to grade to grade without getting a lot of help. And by the time he got through high school, he hated school. He said, and he often says, I don't need to be, in school to be smart. I don't need the book learning. He tried a community college very briefly, didn't work out, and thought, what, all my eggs are going to go in this basket, and I am going to just try to make a lot of money as a professional athlete. And back then you still can today. And he was brave in his own way, because a lot of his teammates did go on to university and finished.
Let's get to the climax and really the big scandal that erupted. It's 1988. It's the Seoul Summer Olympics. It is the 100-meter final. The build-up to this race was enormous because Ben had won the World Championships in Rome the previous year. They were going back and forth in the media. And there was a number of interesting developments leading up to the race, obviously on race day. What stood out to you the most?
Well, Ben had, just a couple of months before Seoul, he had an injury, and he'd split with his coach, Charlie Francis. He'd gone to St. Kitts to pout, really, and then to, work on that hamstring and to understand, I think I really do want to compete in Seoul. So that was a big part of it, and he was out of training for a while, and all the rivals thought, well, what's he doing, drinking beer and playing dominoes? We got this guy in Seoul, no problem. And then he came back, and the money factor going before the race, because he and some of his entourage were sort of, fighting about money. The doctor that he was dealing with at the time wanted a very big payday and was, after Ben. This is before the race. Even basically, I want my fortune. And Ben's like, okay, just when we're done and I win, everyone's going to do well. Don't worry. So all this was playing into this race. But for the race day itself, it was a beautiful day. Ben had false started in the semifinal. And Richard Pound, who was our IOC vice president at the time, he went down and made it known to the track and field officials, you cannot have this man false start again in the final. That's not fair. And he didn't false start this time. So there was some IOC intimidation on Ben's part for the semifinal race. Don't let it happen again. And in the final, it went off like a dream. No false start. And he just annihilated the field and still, put his hand in the air, which he was planning to taunt Carl Lewis all the way
and
along.
looked his way as well.
Looked his way, made sure he saw him. I mean, that was kind of not Ben, but for all of Canada was kind of went,
Yes.
we hate that guy.
We
Way
stuck
to
it to
go.
him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
He was
good.
running for all of us, right?
He was, in that moment, he was running for all of us, and he did something very un-Canadian, was taunt somebody publicly to humiliate him on the worldwide stage, and everyone was like, oh, yeah.
Yes.
They loved it.
I was in my family room, September 24th, 1988, jumping up and down as I see the 979. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a world record. Give us your viewpoint. You were there.
Yes, I was there. I was in the stadium, and my job was to go down and do sidebar on somebody. It turned out being Carl Lewis. But I had a sort of an obstructed view because the interview area was to be under the stadium steps, and it was, first come, first serve sort of thing. So I had an obstructed view, but I had to go down and save seats for the guy writing the main race story, Al Sokol, and myself and others. So as soon as it was over, I went, oh my God, and then ran down. So I wasn't in my fancy seat. I was like sort of halfway down and halfway to the media tent. Yeah. So that was my memory of it.
What was the buzz like in the stadium? Because this is a number we had never seen before, never even thought we'd see.
No, I can't remember. It was a race for the ages because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe 4 or 5 of the men ran under 10 seconds, which had never been done before.
Astonishing.
And then Ben just annihilated his own world record. And it's like the lid blew off. I think the stadium held 70,000, 75,000 people, but everyone was jammed in. There had to be like upwards of 80 or 90, maybe, just jammed in. Everybody was there to watch this race. It was one of those events that you think you're never going to see again in a generation or two, because these two guys were just going to go at it, and you knew it. And it didn't let anybody down. So, and the buzz, it was just buzzing for like an hour after the race. It was just crazy and fun.
And absolutely. And this resonated not only around the world, but definitely here in Canada, where we were ultra proud. Everyone was, a Ben Johnson fan. But it came crashing down pretty quickly. Tell us how it happened.
Yeah. So in Seoul, he ran like middle of the afternoon on a Saturday. By Monday morning, he was told by Charlie at 7 a.m. Seoul time, you're not going to believe this. You tested positive. And that's when he found out his A sample was positive for the anabolic steroid stanozolol. And I think most people know this by now, but the urine sample is split into 2. There's an A sample. They test that. If that's negative, you're fine. If it's positive, then they're going to test the B sample to make sure they're both positive. And if they are, then you've got a positive result. So there was a hearing that night, the Monday night, and in between times they were going to be testing that B sample to see if it matched. And that hearing on the Monday night was very critical. It was supposed to be, secret, but the word was getting out that somebody big had tested positive and that it was Ben Johnson. And at the hearing, he wasn't even invited to his own hearing. They sent him back. The Canadian officials sent him back to his hotel room, said, "We got this. Don't worry. You go. We're going to do our best." And they got the news about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Seoul time on the Tuesday, and Ben was sent home in disgrace.
Before we get to his reaction, I mean, he had never tested positive before, like dozens of tests.
Yes.
Their cycle of drug ingestions, if you will, was catered to the fact that, they're only testing in competition. We can avoid these positive tests. This was a shock beyond anything we'd seen before.
That's right. And that was their big, Charlie, Francis, and Ben's big rallying cry. Ben had been using this stuff religiously for about 7 or 8 years by then. And they, as you just said, they knew when they were going to be tested. Like, it's a race day. So they would cycle off about, say, 3 weeks, 2 weeks before a race, and they'd be totally fine.
Yeah.
And it had been tested before, like many, many, many times, and never failed one. It made no sense that this was the day he would test positive. He was the only track and field athlete in Seoul to test positive, the only one. And the amount we found was so extraordinarily high, and this was part of the documentation too, that it made no sense. It was like he had just taken it.
Yeah.
And so none of it made sense to them. And don't forget, back in those days, Rick, people were naive about steroids. I wasn't even sure how they worked. I knew kind of what they were. I didn't know how you took them. There was so the public didn't really know how they worked and what this meant, and if it's a huge dose in his urine sample from the race day, what that meant. We just thought, oh wow, you took a lot. So none of this made sense. And going on in future time doing stories on this, we realized, that did not make sense. They were right.
As Ben is reliving this through the interview that you're conducting, what are some of the things that he is saying? How do you recognize his facial expression?
He gets angry, then he gets distraught because it was his good name, his reputation. He lost millions. He lost millions of dollars that were coming in at that point, and millions, tens of millions in the future as the world's fastest man. But his big theory was there was an American guy sitting beside me. I don't know who it was. He must have spiked my beer with steroid pills or something, because he was in there and he shouldn't have been in there. And that's true. He should not have been in there. This man's name was Andre Jackson. We found that out much later. The mystery man. And Ben thought he was spiking his beer with steroids, and that might have been a way to have a very high reading very quickly.
There was a lot of debate as to how the Ben Johnson camp should respond to the positive test. Deny, or come clean and say, yeah, you got me?
Well, at the time, they were just going to, for defending him in Seoul, they were just going to say there was a stranger in the room and something must have happened there. That was basically the extent of their defense. When he came back to Toronto, Charlie got word to Ben, we're going to just be quiet. We're going to think about, what to say, and just, like mum's the word, deny, don't say anything. So that was their philosophy, and it really did backfire, because as part of all this, Ben ends up through the Toronto Sun, in an exclusive interview with them, saying, I would like a public inquiry into what happened in Seoul, and that ended up being something that did not do him very well.
Yeah, he really shot himself in the foot. Big time.
He did, but those were his advisors at the time. He had 2 advisors, and he was cut off from Charlie Francis, for better or for worse at the time, but he felt very isolated. He was held in his own house in Scarborough. The media was there day and night, 24 hours a day, so much so back in the day they unplugged their phone. He felt lost, and he was destroyed. Traumatized. I mean, he was 26 years old, but if you can imagine this, slag heap coming down on you, and everyone's abandoning you, your friends, your family, all your sponsors, and your own Canadian track and field officials. Nobody came by to see him. Nobody said, hey, how you doing? Nothing.
It's tragic. Were you at all camped out in front of the Johnson household at the time?
No, at that time, no. I still stayed in Seoul for like another week or so, but when I came back, our focus was then on doing something else. But no, I wasn't one of them. But I know a lot of people who chased him in cars with photographers hanging out the window trying to catch him on the 401. Yeah. Wow.
So we eventually get an inquiry, the Dubbin inquiry. Yes. It is more than just the Ben Johnson inquiry. This is just, steroids in all sports. They look at so many different athletes. They talk to a number of athletes and officials and coaches. Give us the lowdown for people who aren't familiar with what happened. How did it go down?
Well, testimony in front of Charles Dubbin went on for about a year, and they had people who were pencil pushers in Ottawa, sports officials, wrestlers, bobsledders, but a big chunk of it were the track and field people who were at the center of this with Charlie Francis. They had people from the IOC Medical Commission, and all that. So it was very extensive in that way. We learned a lot about the use of performance-enhancing drugs, why they did it. But a couple of key takeaways for this was, one, they totally, in Dubbin's view and with testimony from experts to help him, he totally debunked any kind of sabotage in Seoul. Nobody put pills in Ben's beer. That was Dubbin's, conclusion for that. And Ben was annoyed. The other thing was, Canadian track and field officials had known for a very long time, or should have known or suspected for years, that there was some steroid shenanigans going on with the Charlie Francis group up in Toronto, and Ben Johnson was part of it, and they chose to not really look into it because Ben, was winning a lot and bringing lots of money and prestige to the program, to the country. And the other thing was, on a broader scale, drug testing compliance. Canada had dealt with a lot of drug test failures for wrestlers and other throwers, discus throwers and shot putters and that. From 1983 on, they should have been ready. They should have known more, should have been more aggressive with compliance, making sure random testing was being done, but they held on to all of that until after Seoul. So they were found to be, as officials, lacking in, really trying to put the boots to, drug use, as they, purported to say for many, many years. And then the worst case scenario happens, and they weren't prepared for it in Seoul.
Ben was the last track and field athlete to testify at the Dublin inquiry, if my memory serves me.
I believe so, yes.
And previous to that, there were so many athletes. Angela Sajenko in her diary was a huge smoking gun in this process. Yeah. He could no longer deny the fact that he did what he did. No, and it was another shaming, right? Because Charlie Francis was the first witness. Charlie was afraid of perjury. And I'm just going to tell the truth. Yeah. Angela came on, as you said. Angela had kept notes of everything in her diary, everything she took, everything they did. And then all the other athletes who had been subpoenaed, his teammates were saying, yes, not only do I know Ben did it, I injected him. He was, of course, one of us. And by the very end, Ben was backed into a corner, and it was a very emotional day, with the tears, and he had to admit that he did it. And I do recall there was an overflow room for media, at the inquiry. I was in the main room, but in the overflow room, when Ben said, I shouldn't be laughing, but when Ben said, yes, I was using the steroids, I knowingly used them, I could hear a muffled cheer from the reporters in the other room, because we'd been waiting all this time to hear what is the actual truth. Right. He's suspended, but he eventually comes back onto the track, and it doesn't go according to plan, but do you think he was happy with, returning to the track and kind of ending it on his terms? Although it didn't end on his terms either. No, it didn't. At first he loved it. Now he would say, if I, known what I was going to go through, I would never have ever have come back to track. I would have just left it alone. But he was happy to come back. He wanted to make his money back. He wanted to show that I can compete cleanly. I've got more to give. I'm still a young guy. And one of his first, his first comeback meet was in Hamilton. A very comfortable place for him, and they treated him like a king. They sold out, 17,000 people in the arena. Yeah. It was a good night. He didn't win, but he was second. How is he doing now? He is doing very well. People seem to forget that he's almost 64. Think of him back in those, really in the 80s. I'm still picturing the muscular Ben Johnson racing, right? Yeah. Well, he still works out, and he's a personal coach to some athletes. Not too many track and field, because he doesn't want to be tainting them. That's his, that's his worry. Yeah. But he works with some lacrosse, some hockey athletes, maybe some football, that sort of thing. So he's a coach that way. But because he's banned for life in Canada and around the world, I guess, he cannot even be a certified coach. Wow. So he cannot get a certification in track and field. And there's a bit of a contamination rule for him, too. So if you want to hire Ben to work with your lacrosse team in another country, you better be careful, because you could be in trouble if you work with this guy who's got this lifetime ban. So he's kind of very limited in what he can do. But he's happy, and he's hoping one day to maybe move back to Jamaica full-time and just keep a place here in Toronto to visit now and then. What do you think his legacy is? I think his legacy is two-pronged. One, he gave us the greatest and worst Olympic moment of all time. And secondly, he shook up how we view the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sports forever. Yeah. What do you think the impact is of that? Knowing what we know now and how it all went down, how has the sport been impacted by this? Well, for a long time, times weren't coming down as low as Ben was hitting on them, right, for a while. Rick, I don't know, because, has anything changed in almost 40 years? There are still people out there who, every day, in fact, it doesn't even merit a headline most times. There's so many people who are dinged for violations, And last year in Paris at the at the Olympics,
Noah Lyles won the Olympic gold in men's 100 meters in 9.79 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the same time as 1988. So I think people are more clever about how they use drugs if they're using, and you better be careful if you're dodging the random tests, because they do exist. But I still think some people, have some influence and power if things don't go their way.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the general public has just this mindset that they're all still dirty?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's never going to be shaken either.
No, I don't think so. Now, clearly, they're not all still dirty,
Sure,
for sure. But I think the mindset is like, our guy got dinged, so, and look what's happening now. And those 23 swimmers from China,
mm-hmm.
We found out they were, using an illegal heart medication, and nobody found out about it until a whistleblower, let the world know about it last year. And now we've got the enhanced games. I don't know if you heard about the enhanced games. They're going to be next year in Las Vegas, and there's an Australian guy behind it that says use whatever drugs you want in these swimming, track and fields, part of maybe wrestling, maybe cycling, and we'll test you before your race just to make sure you're not going to get blood clots and die on the track or whatever, but you can use whatever you want.
Wow.
So we've come, I wouldn't say full circle, but it's like, well, what is it? Is it an oval or whatever? So now you've got the enhanced games, pay a lot of money. So these are on the horizon now where you can openly use them, and they will only test you to make sure you're not going to get ill.
Right. Wow. Incredible. It's called World's Fastest Man by Mary Ormsby. It's a great read. You're going to relive the highest of highs and the lowest of lows that Ben Johnson provided us. Thank you so much for coming on CHCH Newsmakers. Wonderful discussion and a wonderful book. Good luck with it.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
You can listen to Newsmakers wherever you go on chch.com/podcasts and wherever you get your favorite podcasts.